They celebrated the centenary of the French Revolution by raising the tallest, most revolutionary structure Paris had ever seen. The year was 1889, and Paris was appalled. They called it monstrous, hideous, absurd. But one man thought differently. To the artist Pierre Seurat, the Eiffel Tower was a triumph of sheer design, a symbol of modernity, the spirit of a new age. He painted it even before it was quite finished, with those little dots of color which were themselves a new way of painting, delighting not only in the logic of its structure, but in the coat of iridescent enamel which made it glitter in the sun. To do such a thing in the face of waves of protest about the building's ugliness from almost everyone else in Paris was rather like admiring that controversial structure of the 1970s, the Pompidou Art Center in the Place Beaubourg, at a time when it, too, had been widely resented and disliked. Seurat admired what was modern when it appealed to his sense of clarity and order. And a blatant display of functional engineering was pure geometry in action. That was the elegance of it. That was the function of structure in his own painting, and what makes his art stand out, alone and challenging, in the middle of the age of Impressionism. What always refuses to be structured elegantly, or even logically, is society. The modern social order in France in the late 1880s, in the view of several writers and philosophers as well as artists, was in a state of transition and disorder. We know that Seurat himself considered he was living through a period of decline and decadence. And there was keen debate within his own circle about what was at that time an early form of anarchist communism. Artists are not usually overtly political animals, certainly Seurat wasn't, but the basic function of their art becomes equivocal when they feel uncertain of their relationship to society. Among Seurat's friends, there was much talk of the problems of social inequality and social injustice. Social justice, harmony in art, wrote one of them. These are the same thing. And yet, Seurat himself, in the Paris of the 1880s, is a man of mystery, a revolutionary so modest, so personally self-effacing, that even today we have to search for him, never quite certain that we fully know him or even yet have completely understood him. This could be almost anywhere in Paris, anonymous as in a sense he is, not where he was actually born in 1859, but where he was brought up and had his roots, number 110, Boulevard Magenta. Today the area is a little more down at heel than it was a century ago, but there's still the neighborhood sense of a typical Parisian quartier about it, a place where the customers are all regulars, a place you belong to. Seurat was bred in the conventions of a settled petit bourgeois society, and outwardly at least, he clung to them. He rented his first professional studio in the next street. A short cut through the market, and he was home with his family for mealtimes. Even later, when he was independent, he dined at home almost every evening of his life, as though conformity and habit were necessary to him. Just one element of his home was not conformist. The church of Saint-Laurent, 2 blocks further down the Boulevard Magenta, was a well-known one in the 1860s, noted particularly for its cult of Our Lady of Cripples. Seurat's father was not only a religious obsessive who lived alone and apart from his family, he was himself disabled. He had lost his right hand in an accident, and on Tuesdays, the only day his family ever saw him, dinner at the Boulevard Magenta involved a regular exhibition of his skill in carving and distributing a leg of lamb, slice by slice, at the end of an intimidating iron hook. In spite of a steady income as a court bailiff in the industrial suburbs, Seurat's father was the one element of the unexpected behind the facade of comfortable middle-class normality. His mother, Ernestine, was Paris-born, modest and sweet-tempered like her son. There were an older brother and sister, never very close to him. There was the solitary, obsessive Antoine, his father. These, of course, are later drawings, with that soft luminosity and tenderness of feeling which makes his style unique. But of his own appearance, we have only the scantiest record. One photo to confirm the gentleness of nature everyone remarked on, and a few drawings by friends to remind us of the head like an Assyrian prince, of the tireless worker who was always so neatly and soberly dressed that Degas used to call him the notary. He was, a friend said later, one of those peaceable but immensely obstinate people you expect to be frightened of everything, but in fact nothing can deter. The immediate neighborhood of his home seems to have left two images lodged deep in the imagination of the young Seurat. One is of the unromantic backwaters of a great city when creeping industrialism begins to take over. The other was the only park in that quarter of Paris, the bosky pleasure ground of the Butte Chaumont, opened to the public when Seurat was just a boy of 8 in 1867. We know nothing of what it may have meant to him, only that later images of what an urban society does with its leisure were to become a central subject of his art. And an artist was what he intended to be. It became clear quite early that that was where the rather solitary, introspective childhood was going to find its fulfillment. At the age of 17, he began his studies at the École des Beaux-Arts. Art school training in Seurat's day was strictly and narrowly traditional. You spent a probationary year satisfying your examiners that you could draw correctly from Greek and Roman statues. Only then might you progress to other things. Art had certain laws, and you learnt these by rote from the example of the past. Your textbook was the works of the old masters. A mouldering warehouse of them from all periods and regardless of style was assembled rank upon rank of life-size casts and copies daring you to emulate them in what is still known as the chapel at the Beaux-Arts. It would be wrong to think of Seurat as a rebellious student. He wasn't. But he preferred to think these things out for himself. Art did have certain laws, that much he passionately believed. But he had his own ideas on what they might be and what was worth copying. He searched out the less familiar, less commonly admired Renaissance artists like Ghiberti. Way up above Pisano's pulpit from the cathedral at Pisa, there were strange, dramatic paintings that no one else regarded much at that time. Copies of the frescoes at Arezzo by Piero della Francesca. Did they bequeath him something? Those measured intervals, those severe, uncompromising profiles, those flattened, front-on compositions? You were taught at the Beaux-Arts that modelling by light and shade was the secret of form. But even in the battered cast of the Parthenon frieze running round the cloister, you could see for yourself that wasn't the whole secret of it. There was the subtlety of pattern in the edges and profiles. You could find it again in the Louvre, the expressiveness of outline, which had always been taught by that master draftsman of French classical art, Ingres. And in the Louvre, Seurat found himself also looking closely at what was then known of as primitive art, the flattened profiles of Assyrian reliefs. Stark silhouettes from forgotten cultures with a silence and a remoteness about them, hieratic as the art of Egypt, which sent him back to first principles to read everything he could lay his hands on about what gave the aesthetic image its power and its containment. He found himself at odds with academic training all over again when it came to the living form. How were you supposed to idealize the actuality in front of you in terms of Greek and Roman statues? At the end of his second year, he was still only listed 47th out of a class of nearly 80. But quietly, stubbornly, he was teaching himself, moving towards a new concept of drawing which has been the envy and admiration of so many later artists. One of them today is the sculptor, Henry Moore.
Seurat, to me, has always been one of the great draftsmen of the world. I mean, if one had to name 10 or 12, perhaps up to 20, which I could easily, Seurat would certainly be in that number. As someone to whom drawing, that is understanding light and form and three-dimensional form and trying to express it on a flat surface, this is what he struggled to do from a student and came through to do in the end marvelously. When I really began to appreciate and love Seurat was when I was asked to be a war artist. And after doing the shelter drawings, I then was asked to do drawings in the coal mines. And below you have the miners have a lamp on their helmet, and they can carry a lamp as well. But everything is pitch darkness, and you only see what is happening by light, by a directional light too. And a form 3 yards away was invisible because the light would only penetrate that distance in real deep blackness. Now, the coal face itself, with the coal dust and the coal machines making dust, it was very like Seurat's work. The light came through a dust kind of atmosphere. In trying to get this feeling, because you couldn't draw in the dark, I could try to make little notes to remember, and then I would get back to the hotel at night time and try to... I had a sketchbook with me, but it really was a different attitude to form, because a form, another miner would loom from the distance. You might hear him coming, but you wouldn't begin to see him until he was 2 or 3 yards away. And it made me realize what, not skill alone, but what understanding Seurat had of form looming into your vision. His kind of drawing concentrated so much on the side of drawing which is using the white paper to give you the light, and his pencil or charcoal or whatever, Conte crayon or whatever it was that he drew with, to show where the light didn't come. He used that to make light come off the paper, almost as though it had as though the paper was luminous in some way and was giving you the light. I mean, in here, the light is coming with the drawing of his mother from the window. I'm sure that he probably found that by using a textured paper, a paper that was not absolutely smooth, he could get a sparkle come off the half-tones. I mean, as in this one, there's the little grain of the paper. Although it's quite dark, there's a sparkle coming off. It's light. He's getting a luminosity. He really is drawing light. There's one in particular. This is his father eating with a bottle in the foreground. And the bottle is so dark that it's used as the key of blackness to compare with the white that he wants to show the light of And I think Seurat was a very intellectual person. We know that from his study of the science of light and of colour and this is... but he had also, which you can tell, the love of nature and the love of the object that he was doing, that he was drawing. And probably when he was drawing his mother, there was this emotional relationship with the subject matter that made it better than if you were just drawing, I don't know what, a model, a paid model. Some people have the idea, that either you can draw or you can't. It's a gift, but your brain comes into it as well as your facility. It's not just cleverness of hand, it's also understanding and responding to the love comes into it. The idea that artists are just good at the one thing because they've got a gift for it and that's all is not true at all.
One of the signs of a great artist in the making is not only that he knows what he wants of art, but that he can find it where others have failed to look. Seurat is one of the first to seize for his own purposes on the ephemeral art of the streets. A whole collection of popular imagery was found in his studio after his death. Fashion plates of the period, posters, religious prints, broadsheets, caricatures, cartoons. Again, it's all a question of the profile, the silhouette. That's what catches the eye, that's what gives an image its character, its immediacy, its wit of observation. He would make use of images like these. But in the meantime, aged 19 and due under French law for military service, he had to endure their crudities in real life. He served the minimum 12 months and then bought himself out. But he hadn't wasted his time. Seurat never wasted time. He had kept a couple of sketchbooks making outline drawings of the conscript's life, and he had had a breathing space to take stock of himself and of where he wanted to go. He returned to Paris, no longer a student, but with eyes sharpened to the spectacle of modern life. A world seen in black and white as yet, the bare drama of shape revealed by light. He would get that right first. Colour could come later, and he wanted to keep things in a logical order, one thing at a time. Beyond the city itself, on the northern outskirts, there's an area they called the Zone. What attracted Seurat to such a no-man's land at this time, one can only guess. Quite possibly the first stirrings of political and social conscience in a young middle-class radical who had never seriously wanted for money. It was a place where rag pickers came to sift through the city's rubbish dumps. The realist writers of the period, Zola, Huysmans, the Goncourt brothers, had often described this twilight area of blighted hope, where civilization seemed to peter out. He started taking to long, solitary walks at dusk and on into the night. Life in that shadowy gloom is anything that stands upright against the flat, dark level of the earth. Something kept drawing him back to the wasteland of the semi-industrial suburbs, even later when he had already started to paint. This was the unromantic, unsentimental reality of modern life, and he drew it as if to find out how much he could say about it with the simplest possible means, as if determined to prove that the poetry of vision is not in what you see, but how you see it. The task he had set himself was to make an art as classical and enduring as the Parthenon frieze, out of the none too beautiful world that a hard-headed capitalist society was so relentlessly creating. He was both critic and bystander, watching how the drift and the energies of city life left individual human beings stranded in silence and loneliness. He was quite deliberate in what he was doing. He had worked out how he would get there step by step, element by element. He knew now how to express what he wanted in the language of drawing. The next stage was to find out more about the language of color and the language of paint. And in order to explore them, he moved first away from the city, out into the countryside, some 40 miles to the southeast. For 2 generations, the forest of Fontainebleau had been a gathering ground for artists preaching truth to nature and the virtues of painting in the open air. This place might have something to teach him about color and the feel of a paintbrush in his hand. But he'd come here with something else in mind also. At the edge of the forest in the village of Barbizon had lived and worked until only 8 years ago one of the heroic figures of modern French art, the great Jean-François Millet. Millet, the socialist who used to read Homer in the original Greek. Millet, who had used his profound knowledge of the classical tradition to paint not what the academics of the Beaux-Arts were always painting, but the dignity of labor. The timeless patience, suffering, and grandeur of the modern dispossessed. And Millet was what Seurat wanted to be, a painter who disciplined his art in drawing.
I think I got this Millet drawing after I had the first of the Seurat. And looking at the Seurat each day and so on, I realized that Millet had an influence on him. And so I did several drawings of this type where the sunset, where the horizon is giving all the light, which again is reminiscent of Millet. I think one could take small pieces of the cover of this Millet catalogue. You see, there's a Seurat. There's a beauty. There's the horizon idea. That could make a Seurat.
Working between Barbizon and Paris, Seurat concentrated on painting. His ideas were all beginning to lock together. Ideas about art, ideas about the proper subject matter for art. He was 23, still totally unknown, but he knew now it was within his grasp to achieve the synthesis he dreamed of. One part of it would be an art designed and structured with all the intellectual precision of Poussin or Piero della Francesca. But the other would be about life and living, an art which had something to say about the condition of society. Millet had shown him one direction in which to look, and he made painting after painting of it. The silhouettes are still there. The contrasts of tonal darks and lights are still there. Even the dense, closed forms of those Egyptian figures he had studied in the Louvre. Courbet, the first true socialist painter, had celebrated the labor of stonebreakers. Now Seurat took up the theme. The brushstrokes look huge because these are still very small paintings, sometimes little larger than 16 inches by 12. And gradually we become aware that he had also been looking hard at those painters 20 years older than himself, who were still in the early 1880s the most controversial in Paris, those revolutionaries of light, color and spontaneity, the Impressionists. The Impressionists generally painted the bourgeoisie at leisure. Seurat would paint working people at leisure. Not downriver at fashionable boating places like Argenteuil, where Monet and Renoir had painted sunlight dappling the water, but on the unromantic edge of the city, where you could see factories on the horizon. The place he chose in the spring of 1883 was at Asnières, and he started making little impressionist-like oil studies of it on the backs of cigar box lids, shifting around different ideas and motifs and groupings for a grand composition. He was preparing himself now in earnest to make his public debut, and he would make it with the first major canvas he had ever attempted. It would take a sustained effort of will and over a year to plan and execute it, but he would put into it everything he had learned so far about the orchestration of color, atmosphere, and space. Then, modeling himself on Millet's practice, he worked out the figures in a series of incomparable drawings. And into the figure studies went everything he had learnt about contour, profile, contrast, tonality, and the structure of form. And his subject would be modern life, the life of the people, and he would make an enduring image of them in a painting 10 feet long and 6.5 feet high. The unforced grandeur of Seurat's vision had been modelled on the old masters, and the Bathers has taken its place today alongside the greatest of them in the National Gallery in London. Only at close quarters does the thick, enamelled quality of the paint betray something of the labour he had lavished on every inch of its surface. Every nuance had been worked over, and some would be worked over and modified yet again after the picture had been exhibited. But when it was, at the huge Salon des Indépendants of 1884, it was hung over the refreshment bar in an anteroom and almost overlooked. In the background of the picture are two boats heading for the opposite shore, and that in fact was where Seurat had already gone. Hardly pausing to recuperate his energies, he had started on an idea for a picture even bigger and much more complex than the first. There's a long, narrow spit of land lying off the north bank of the Seine at this point, called the island of the Grande Jatte. When Seurat knew it, it was a popular local park and recreation ground, nothing very glamorous or fashionable, but a place which attracted, on Sundays in particular, when it was at its busiest, a fairly motley cross-section of Parisian life. For months on end, Seurat spent his mornings here, forgetting about lunch and often plagued by the curiosity of small boys, making studies and observations in the open air, which would then be sifted and collated and worked up into compositional motifs in the studio. You can still just catch an echo on the Grande Jatte of the life that once went on there. But for the most part, the island's now either derelict or built over. Only at one end, there's an avenue of trees left. But waste no sentiment about that for Seurat's sake. That devotee of geometry would almost certainly have delighted in the spectacle of modern skyscrapers. What he did see was vertical trees, horizontal shadows. A kind of stage on which he would eventually marshal a cast of more than 40 characters. Methodical as ever, he studied first the space, the atmosphere, the color values. Then started placing the figures and characteristic incidents he'd observed from life. At the geometrical center, an image of childhood innocence, and all around it the curious, compromised diversity of adult life. This is his final study before he started on the painting itself. The great 10-foot canvas hangs today in the Art Institute of Chicago, one of the major turning points in French art, and surely one of the most monumental and yet one of the strangest paintings of the whole 19th century. One can see what it is. Can one ever be wholly sure what it means? It's both real and yet not at all realistic. The real Grande Jatte, as everybody knew, particularly on Sunday afternoons, was rather a rowdy place and not altogether respectable. Seurat makes it look, on the surface, almost stiff with respectability. Did he intend his Parisian audience to detect the faintest undertone of satire? That under its parasols and top hats, bourgeois society wasn't perhaps everything it liked to pretend? Loaded juxtapositions are everywhere. Images from the comic strips and fashion plates he collected, contrasted with that of the child in white. Little eruptions of animal energy with the lady's monkey on a string, the monkey, age-old symbol of unchastity. Yet the painting has a lyrical quality also. Lyrical in the very shapes themselves. in the parasol theme echoed everywhere in an intricate counterpoint of semicircles like a visual fugue, an abstract music of form. He had even thought out what happened where the picture ended, how to organize a transition between the color within the painting itself and the color of the frame and even the wall beyond it. The system he'd evolved for pulling all his effects together in a unified texture was the technique of little touches of unmixed color, the technique he called Divisionism. It was entirely his own invention, and he'd got the idea from his obsessive reading about the science of optics, which he'd begun in the library at the Beaux-Arts. Scientific interest had been focusing on the question of color throughout the 19th century. How do colors relate to each other? How is our perception affected by them? And the pioneering work on the subject had been a book by the French chemist called Michel-Eugène Chevreul. Chevreul had been director of what was once the Royal Manufactory for Tapestries and Carpets at Les Gobelins, and he was a few years short of his 100th birthday when Seurat came to visit him here. A dusty relic of his color circle, his famous system for working out opposite and complementary colors and how to harmonize them, still hangs over the door to his laboratory. For what Chevreul had demonstrated as a practical chemist concerned with the dyeing of wools is that no color is ever seen wholly and purely by itself. Colors act upon each other. And not only that, each color will always, to the observing eye, evoke something of its opposite, in what he called the Law of Simultaneous Contrast. In charge of the matching and blending of up to 14,000 different shades and hues, Chevreul had seen this happening on the carpet looms of the Gobelin factory itself. Seen from the back, larger sequences of form and color resolve themselves into a multiplicity of individually contrasted knots. Seen from the front, individuality is lost. Colors begin to work together. But the illusion that they mix has only been started in the weaving. It's completed by the eye. Seurat was trying to deal not only with problems of color, but with color's relationship to light. And it was while he was taking a holiday down on the Normandy coast, painting a headland called the Bec du Hoc, that he fully developed his own divisionist theories. He hadn't finished the Grande Jatte yet, but would a pure science of color help him to get even more light into the canvas than even the Impressionists had achieved? It's hard now to tell if he actually got the effect he wanted, because some of his pigments have since darkened. But we know at least what the aim was: to lay equal-sized dots of unmixed color side by side, and never to mix them first on the palette, as the Impressionists tended to do. Then, at a certain distance from the eye, they would blend optically, giving the effect not of painted color, but of colored light. It would take immense patience and precision, but the theory sounded logical, it sounded impressive, and it did away with guesswork. Seurat was still only in his mid-20s, but his dot technique shot him into almost instant celebrity. From now on, there was a clear distinction between what he and his supporters thought of as romantic impressionism and his own style, which he called scientific impressionism. But how sound, in fact, were his color theories in practice? The art of Bridget Riley is also closely concerned with the perception of color and the experience of color relationships. Seurat and his work have always meant a great deal to her.
I think one of the things that's most appealing about him was that he wanted the new. He wanted tremendously to be a modern artist in his and science was actually the new excitement of the time, and he wanted to embrace this, to weld it into art, to draw on its resources. I once painted out this colour wheel of Seurat's, which he used for to identify contrasts. I added to the pure pigmentary centre the two outer rings, each colour lightened with white. And you can see in the red group and in the yellow-green group, on the edges, throws up an illusion of the adjacent colour, the little halations of orange as opposed to purple that occur in the red group, or on the other side, the stronger blue and the lighter green, which are made by simultaneous contrast of colours. It is this, the surrounding influences of everything which are interacting the whole time, which make a generalization about colour quite impossible to maintain. And with these tiny, tiny units that Pointillism has, the interactions tend to cancel, so that in fact the brilliance results in an optical grey, a beautiful tinted grey. I think because he was painting at close range a great deal of the time, and also because it was part of his nature to insist. He was extremely stubborn and obstinate, you know. It's part of his strength too, this tenacity, and part of the dedication with which he worked. But it did mean that he refused, so to speak, to believe the evidence of his senses. That must have been telling him that what he was in fact arriving at were gloriously tinted, soft, pearly greys. I think it was a danger that he must have felt, because he did make these summer excursions out to actually confront a direct experience and to paint it, you know, one-to-one in the great Impressionist tradition. But when he got back to the studio where he finished these works, then up came these other values.
Bridget Riley learned even more about his methods when she copied this particular Seurat, the bridge at Courbevoie, which now hangs in the galleries of the Courtauld Institute in London.
Probably one of the most built of all his landscapes. These verticals march back in space. These horizontals tie the painting, bring the painting slowly towards you, with what you might call sort of counter actions, and the same thing with these verticals. It's based in his terms on a violet, blue and yellow-green contrast. And one of the things that I found when I copied it was that he must have worked over the entire surface. For instance, with the blues, I think he must have worked over all the blue tendencies, and then with the pinks and with the greens and with the yellows, and then round again, modulating each area so that in fact he's building up a fluctuating surface, which he can then, so to speak, push about by adding or painting out his different colour groups. The grey of this smoke and the chimney is made up of yellow and blue. All these pearly greys are actually made up of little contrasts. This black has orange, red, blue, green, all together blending into a vibrant black, not a dead black, but a vibrant black. It's what you might call a consolidated experience. It's very calm, extremely delicate. It's a painting of repose, really. Very, it's an eternal painting. A Monet, like the one over there, of the same subject, which in fact is also based on complementaries, probably quite unconsciously so, the orange and the blue, is full of, particularly the bank of trees on the left-hand side, full of the most unexpected colours, unexpected situations. It's a painting of dazzling freshness. One feels that the clouds are actually moving across the sky. One very interesting thing is Monet's famous peripheral looking out of the corner of your eye. Seurat scrutinized and Monet glanced. And I think there's a world of difference in the two ways of approaching a subject.
It was during his short summer visits down to the fishing ports of the coast that Seurat was able to check his eye and his instinct against the actualities of nature. He needed the relaxation from long winter months labouring over his major compositions, often working by artificial light far into the night. But at Honfleur, he turned his back on the picturesque attractions of the old town. What drew him was the life of the harbour. It was a perfect subject for him, with all its subtle geometry of masts, sails, and rigging crowding the long line of the quayside. But out towards the sea, there was the challenge of space and light. And here, above all, Seurat, like no other painter, makes the particular moment stand still in time. Smaller and more intimate than Honfleur, the little harbour of Port-en-Bessin, where he stayed in 1888, gave him a complex of buildings he could study from different angles, at different times of the day, in its weekday aspect and when it was dressed up in its Sunday best. This is the cool, clear light of early morning. Presumably, he couldn't possibly have painted such pictures entirely on the spot. But sharpness of eye and patience of hand must here have been exquisitely attuned to achieve such delicacy of observation. The shadows now are pointing north. It's midday. Early afternoon, the buildings backlit from the southwest. and the silence and the stillness made palpable by strange figures placed like punctuation marks in the open architecture of space. A change of angle to follow the evening light, and a warmth creeping into the colour from the setting sun. The last group of what are called his marines was painted at Gravelines at the mouth of the shipping canal which links the inland port of Rouen with the Channel coast. Here the space and the light have almost bleached the colour from his paint. The angled masts of yachts only serve to emphasize the vast serenity of the horizon, the timeless immobility of bollards and lighthouse. People tell me they see poetry in what I do, Seurat once said in his best non-committal manner. No, I apply my method. That is all. It wasn't just method, of course, by any means. But in Paris it was being said, even among a rapidly growing band of admirers, that this dot technique was all very intriguing, but it was really only good for outdoor subjects. Seurat, as one might expect, had considered that point already. He was thinking back to the problems the Beaux-Arts had set him, and to the life class. He would reinterpret a favourite academic theme in his own terms, and one pose he would give them adapted from a famous classical statue, the Spinario, the boy with a thorn in his foot. He would combine the side view with a frontal view, standing. But his model would not be idealized. She would be real. And the back view would pay outright homage to Ingres in the pose of his famous Valpassant bather. The setting would be his own studio, with his own recently exhibited painting of the Grande Jatte against one wall. A picture within a picture, an outdoor subject as background to an indoor subject, pointing a world of contrasted attitudes and meanings. Here the status symbols of costume are laid aside, the flaunted parasols folded away. In this closed room there can be no public pretensions. In the earlier painting, even the sexual symbol of the monkey has been quietly obscured by a symbol of sexual tenderness and purity. The reticent, fastidious Seurat only hints in Les Poseurs at the erotic undertones of his subject. But of all painters, he is the least predictable. Secretive, intensely private as he was, he kept here in his last home the subject of his own unorthodox tribute to the erotic possibilities of art. This plump, complacent, probably pregnant girl of 20 was his secret mistress, who had borne him a son before the Seurat family even knew of her existence. He paints her with a kind of amused devotion, handling the paint as if it were itself some sensuous emanation from her own powder puff. Her name was Madeleine Knobloch, a professional showgirl without, so they said, a brain in her head. But Seurat lavishes all his powers of invention and ingenuity on the frivolous, intimate details of her toilette. The date of the painting is 1889, and he seems already to be anticipating that quality of line which would be called Art Nouveau. Certain angles, certain measurable directions of line, he had decided, could evoke quite specific emotions, and his tribute to Madeleine blossoms with all those upward-springing shapes which for Seurat denoted joy, delight, and gaiety of spirit. But for us today there is one tragedy in the picture. He was persuaded to substitute a vase of flowers for what originally had been his own face looking down at her. So we are robbed of the only self-portrait of Seurat known to us.
La star se tord, la star se tire.
More and more, Seurat found his image of modern society focusing on that of its street life and its entertainment.
Oh, soyez poli avec tes caméras. Ah! Ils ont tous les droits. Voilà ce que je ne veux pas piffer. Ce n'est pas normal. Vous êtes des voleurs.
He found himself observing that world where the crowd is drawn for its casual amusement to a display of skill, the world of the public performer. He wanted to analyze a mood and a social phenomenon, and we know that at least one of his closest friends joined in to the extent of being painted by him in Pierrot costume. Seurat could appreciate the positive values of entertainment, but he was still questioning the society he watched. He was only 29, and it had only been 7 years ago, before he became famous, that he had wandered the suburbs at dusk, drawing the rag pickers of the zone. The image of how a society enjoys itself, which he wanted to paint now, could not be carefree. It would always be ambiguous. There would always be a pathos underlying it all. La Parade is the most mysterious of all Seurat's paintings. A street band advertising a circus, but ranged like figures in an Egyptian frieze, and led by a trombonist like a gallows man. In the haunted gaslight, one seems to hear the voice of the boy poet Rimbaud crying out at the beauty and the terror of the world. J'ai seul la clé de cette parade. Only I hold the key to this passing show.
Fort avec les mains, fort avec les pieds, maestro, s'il vous plaît.
Just possibly in the image of that strange and solitary figure playing for the crowd's amusement, there lies something of Seurat's own fierce pride, perhaps his anger, at the role the creative spirit can have thrust upon it. It was not such an uncommon idea at the time. The artist as clown, a kind of eternally displaced person in a society which claps and applauds but has little real understanding. Just over 10 years later, the young Picasso would depict a world of vagabond players and itinerant acrobats with something of the same thought in mind. If you're looking for symbolism, compare the beauty of the dancer and the ugliness of the spectator, the immaculate structure of the painting and the ignominy of the subject. So wrote another of Seurat's friends about this picture of a dance hall. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't, a satire on the bourgeoisie as audience. But for all the poster imagery Seurat packs into it, and the fluttering symbols of gaiety he scatters through a brilliantly taught design, the tone remains curiously hectic and strained, as though there were an element of parody about it, for all its high spirits. The very meaning of performance is something Seurat always abstracts from the actual performance he's witnessed and translates into what he does himself with line, colour and space on a flat canvas. He borrowed some of his imagery quite openly from circus posters of the period which he had pinned up in his studio. The whole composition is planned with a tight geometry whose guidelines you can still just catch glimpses of beneath the first layer of paint. But no ringmaster could have disciplined more strictly the visual ideas he found there, the bucking and twisting energy of line which more than ever foreshadows Art Nouveau, the abrupt zigzags, the garish medley of colour marshalled into primary contrasts of blue, yellow and red. And the quirkish, half-satirical treatment of the audience, mouths, eyes, even hats, lapels and necklines, up-tilted at the precise angle for the symbolic line of gaiety. It's a painting people have often admired, but few have ever really liked, as though too much intellect and too little heart had left it curiously mirthless. Did Seurat really intend it to feel so uneasy? We can't tell. While it was still unfinished on his easel, he complained one day of a sore throat. 3 days later, it was just after Easter 1891, he was dead. It was either diphtheria or a form of meningitis. We don't exactly know. A fortnight afterwards, it killed his 1-year-old son, Pierre Georges, also. Seurat died at the age of 31. He could have been at his height in the Paris of Picasso, Braque and Matisse. As it is, we think of him almost as a modern artist. And we don't feel a sense of incompleteness. The last word should remain with his closest friend and disciple, Signac. He had passed the painter's problems in review and said the last word, more or less, on all of them. Black and white, harmony of line, composition, color harmony, color contrast, even the frame. What more can one ask of a painter?